Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's session on integrating monitoring and evaluation. I am Daphne Randall, a junior consultant at Turner & Townsend, and today we are joined by Alison Skillen, who is a director at Turner & Townsend. So this is a retrofit information support and expertise RISE event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, delivered by Turner & Townsend. I'll hand over now to Alison, who will start today's presentation. Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us today in the RISE Masterclass. So I will talk you through the agenda and then we'll just go through and talk about some of the background to this. So in terms of the aims of today's session, so we're going to cover basic statutory requirements. Most of you, I assume, are involved in the Warm Home Scheme, so you'll be looking at it through that lens. Organisational monitoring and evaluation, intended outcomes, basic monitoring and evaluation, questionnaire features, and then how resources and Q&A. It's worth me saying at the outset of this is a massive topic. Okay, so to give you some background to me before I start getting into the topic that we're going to cover in the masterclass. So my early career, I worked in telecommunications and network engineering. I was Cisco engineer for many years, designing large national infrastructure projects for telecommunications and sharing of network type traffic. So mostly for radio and television. That was my primary role. So my worldview of monitoring and evaluation was I was setting up systems that were monitoring and evaluating every component of a system, doors, fire, logs, down to missed data packets at a millisecond level. That's my background. Later on, I moved into this world of energy systems and retrofit. Specifically, I retrained on that because it was something I felt very passionately about and moved into that world. But I brought with me all of that background and knowledge. I would have to say that this is a less mature world that I've moved into in terms of monitoring and evaluation. There's definitely a lot less structure, even across national energy systems. If you go into, a substation, you'd be staggered how little monitoring and data that is brought back on your local substation. Typically, the substation understands that something's gone wrong because a fuse goes pop and they send somebody out and have a look at it. That's not unusual. So the background and world that I came from is very different to the one we're in today, and this is an evolving and developing sector. So we know that there's, it's definitely maturing, but there's a long way to go. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is what's your basic requirements, and then I'm going to give you some little examples where you can start thinking about more in-depth monitoring. Actually, where the sector's going, there's a lot of innovation happening in this space, and in an hour I can't possibly cover that, but there is innovation happening. I think if you are interested in it, there is lots and lots of guidance out there. The Building Performance Network, who are now aligned with the Good Homes Alliance, have done huge amounts of in-depth work on this. So there's lots and lots of material out there. But today's class is just going to be about covering what are the basics you need, what are the kind of early steps into this world to think about how we do monitoring and evaluation, and then actually potentially, I might just bring in some of the things where I think the sector's going and where we can start to think more with a more strategic eye on where we can take this going forward. So that's the plan for today. Okay, so in terms of basic statutory requirements, this is taken from PAS 2035. So I appreciate not all of you will have read the PAS 2035 documentation, but the retrofit coordinator is there to ensure that every retrofit project is subject to monitoring and evaluation to determine whether the intended outcomes, and I will say intended outcomes is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this statement, of the retrofit project have been realised. To identify, learn from any project-specific or systematic problems with assessment, dwelling assessment, retrofit design, installation, testing, commissions or handover of EEMs. What the PAS 2035 will not do for you is tell you what your intended outcomes are. So already, in terms of what on earth do we mean by intended outcomes, how do we define those, what do they look like, that opens up a whole much bigger subject to debate. But your statutory requirements, which if you're working under the Warm Home Schemes, you know that all of your projects need to be PAS 2035 compliant. You must have a retrofit coordinator on the project. That retrofit coordinator will be there to see that the monitoring and evaluation is meeting the intended outcomes of the project. So again, further, just a bit more detail on the statutory requirements. So different levels of monitoring and evaluation should be carried out as appropriate. basic monitoring and evaluation should be applied to every completed domestic retrofit project. So again, it sounds really straightforward when you look at that, but actually what is as appropriate? What on earth does that mean? Those are the kind of questions that we need to start thinking about when we're considering monitoring and evaluation, and that absolutely goes back to the intended outcomes. And then potentially we've got intermediate monitoring and evaluation should be applied to projects for which, in the opinion of the client, the retrofit coordinator and the retrofit evaluator, basic monitoring and evaluation indicates the outcomes are significantly different from those originally agreed or intended, or unintended consequences of the retrofit work. So, for example, we've got an example here where, the occupants have experienced fuel poverty prior to retrofit, unable to heat their homes. Benefits of retrofit are around increased comfort rather than monetary savings, and that should be considered. So all of this is basically framing back and saying, well, what are the intended outcomes of the project? What is it that we're there? And that in itself is quite a complicated process. When we talk about intended outcomes, I mean, there's lots and lots in the space when it comes to monitoring evaluation. So I've been working in retrofit for many years now, and there are lots and lots of standards that are associated with retrofit, and none of them are specified in PAS 2035 as your intended outcome, but there are frameworks out there available. So, to give you a headline example, something like ENERFIT, for example, has been around quite a long time. It's the retrofit sister part of the passive house structure, but it gives very prescriptive standards, outcomes for an individual building that you can then monitor and evaluate against to see whether you have met those intended outcomes. So it might be, what is the thermal performance of the building? How much carbon is it actually emitting as a building? So all of those things can be built in to an agreed and stated standard if that is how your retrofit project is operating. In case of the warm homes, from a policy point of view, the intended outcomes of the projects are typically that your projects meet EPCC. That would be an intended outcome. That the residents should not be impacted by higher bills. That could be an intended outcome of the project. And we'll talk a bit more about those as we go through. I think the other thing that we need to think about is, and this is where it starts to get slightly more complicated, is, so there's the intended outcomes for an individual building. Does it meet the thermal performance of what we want it to, how we want it to perform? Then there's the scheme guidance, there's intended outcomes for that. So you need to think about, well, is it meeting those intended outcomes? But then there's thinking about actually what's your organisation looking to in terms of intended outcomes. So, so much of the work that I've done on retrofit over the years has been, we end up getting into silos with retrofit, and actually in a lot of cases there's significant benefits from retrofitting that are much more holistic than that, or that fit into other areas of other parts of our organisation. So you might have separately, the decarbonisation team or the energy efficiency team might be separate from the damp and mould team. As part of your retrofit project, the intended outcomes could be working with those teams to prioritise and look at which homes have got significant issues with damp and mould, what's the stock condition of the homes, all of those different points to say that actually then that will help you design and plan your retrofit project, and then what you're going to monitor and evaluate against those things. So understanding what different teams want in terms of the outcomes of a project is really important as well. And then of course you've got your residents, actually what are their intended outcomes? How do they want to live? I mean, don't know whether you're finding this, but certainly many years ago I worked for a charity doing on the ground work with residents, communities around climate change, decarbonisation of homes, all of that kind of thing. And it's, people aren't, or certainly they weren't back when I was doing it. They're not there talking about energy efficiency measures or EPCs or all of those kind of things. The things that matter to people is the comfort of their home. Do they feel warm? Do they feel able to put the heating on in the winter? Actually, how are they living? Does it the way that their home is impact on the way that they live day to day? So the intended outcomes can be also, thinking about what your residents' concerns, problems, issues are that the retrofit project is looking to address. So there's lots and lots of different lenses that we can look at intended outcomes around. Excellent quote here. So don't waste customers' time asking them questions unless you're prepared to act on what they say. It's a very good point to make. So I think it's really easy with all of these things to have a vision in mind, what you want the retrofit project to do, and then kind of where you're going with that. But without question, understanding what your customers, clients, residents, stakeholders need out of the retrofit project is absolutely critical. And then how do you build that into your intended outcomes? And then how do you build that into your monitoring and evaluation strategy? Because that's really critical. So we're going to start to go through a couple of the specifics around retrofit measurable intended outcomes. So these are some of the examples. As I was talking, there's some different examples of intended outcomes. So you could have reduced fuel use, lowered bills as a percentage of income, alleviating mold and the condensation issues, improved indoor air quality, reducing operational carbon. I mean, that's a really significant one. And actually, not that necessarily that straightforward to measure through just an EPC approach. Building performance. So is there standards now? I mentioned about NFIT earlier, so that's a very well-known standard, but there are other standards out there. The LETI standard, for example, is easier to reach than the NFIT standard. There's all sorts of different standards out there, or you could set your own standards. So I've worked with local authorities that have had a vision and a strategy in mind for all of the housing stock within their district or their local area. And then they've set a standard that they would like to achieve. Increased comfort. So we're seeing this coming up more and more at the moment around summertime overheating. And then, of course, well-being, fewer health complaints. And actually, again, you'll perhaps be aware that AWAB's law has just come through legislation. And when we're talking about well-being or fewer health complaints, actually, in some cases, it's much more than that. It's much more serious than that. So absolutely, we don't want our intended outcomes, or we want to make sure through our intended outcomes that we are mitigating the risk of those kind of impacts on our residents. So these are a few examples of some of the intended outcomes. Now, this isn't an either or scenario. There's absolutely lots of these that are all integral and can be integrated together in terms of your intended outcomes. What I would say is, obviously, the more intended outcomes you layer up, the more complex it becomes in terms of your strategy, in terms of your measure mix, in terms of your planning. That depends on what archetypes that you have within your retrofit project. So whilst it's not impossible, for example, to use an NFIT standard to do conservation homes, it certainly would be challenging. So understanding what the homes are that you're looking to retrofit, and then what the intended outcomes are for those, and then where you can bring those intended outcomes together as an overall strategy for a deliverable project. And that is important, is the strategy must be deliverable, can be quite a complicated process. So what do we mean by basic monitoring and evaluation? So this is taken from PAS 2035. As I said, I don't know how many of you will have read PAS 2035, but the requirements and what you must do is include the use of a measure-specific questionnaire distributed to the client and occupants of the retrofitted dwellings to establish, and then it lists all of these things. So have the intended outcomes been achieved? Well, obviously you need to know what those were before you asked if they'd been achieved. Have there been any unintended or unexpected consequences of the work? So, for example, if you've put a set of solutions into the homes, have bills in fact increased? Does the resident in fact feel less comfortable, colder? Are the systems working appropriately? Are they satisfied with the outcomes and the process of that? And then any points of dissatisfaction, anything that's not working. Now, again, your residents may not know if something's not working. They may just be about saying, well, actually, this is how my home feels. And then whether there's any other comments. And just a note there that that basic M&E should be completed and reported within 3 months after handover of the retrofit project. So that is an absolute basic requirement for your retrofit coordinator to manage and be delivered as part of your retrofit project. As I said in my introduction, it's sort of a world away from where I started. I was very used to a very technological based set of how you do monitoring and evaluation, looking at very clear data points, measurable impacts, changes, all of those kind of things. This is using a measure specific questionnaire, so you can imagine it's much more subjective in terms of the feedback you're going to get, the questions that you're asking, and then what do you do with that? So it PAS 2035 approach is, I would say, probably the lightest part of the PAS 2035 process in terms of requirements. And there's lots of reasons behind that, but just as a general statement, that's probably where it starts. So what could this look like? Supposing your intended outcomes are around energy savings and comfort. So you've decided to do a general occupant feedback survey, a post-construction. So you've done that after first fix, and that's going to be connected by your retrofit evaluator. And then your team or your coordinator are going to do the evaluation and analysis on that, with working obviously very closely with your designers and contract teams. The other thing could be, so that could be one survey that you're doing is, have you noticed your bills going down? Have you seen an improvement in terms of heating? Are you less concerned about putting the heating on since you've had the retrofit measures installed? The other one that could be really, really valuable. So this survey is obviously looking at multiple areas of evaluation is around disruption and the impact of that. And again, that can be really, really valuable. So it's very easy on paper. You do lots of modelling around saying, well, what measures should I do and what pathway should I put together to achieve my intended outcomes? I want to dramatically reduce the bills, or I want to reduce carbon, a combination of both of those things. Therefore, I'm going to take an approach that, for example, uses IWI in my homes, along with perhaps some floor insulation or other measures. But when you go out and do your impacts, your evaluation survey, actually what you find is you've got really negative feedback. The residents couldn't cope with the upheaval. It was really disruptive. It was really challenging. So their overall sense of that measure, although it did perhaps in the longer term improve their feelings around comfort and warmth in the home, the stress and anxiety they went through was so much that they would never recommend it to anybody. And that would give you a problem later on in terms of doing further resident engagement. Resident groups, they talk to each other, they share insights of how it's gone. That could be something that could be really challenging. So that could be really valuable feedback and saying, well, actually, if we still think that measure is a really valuable measure because it achieves our intended outcomes, what do we need to do? What steps we need to put in place to reduce the disruption, to improve the impact to the residents, to manage those challenges that they have reported back to us through that survey. So again, that's part of the occupant survey, and that's something that you can pick up and then analyse as a team. We are starting getting into slightly more technical now, which obviously quite exciting there. Air tightness, so that is absolutely required by PAS 2035. You've got a target metric there, so that specific target metric, so that is not saying that actually a home should achieve that target metric, although that could be what they're looking for in this case. In PAS 2035, generally that target metric is used that if you are below that, you would expect to be putting some quite significant solutions in to manage ventilation within the home. It's likely you're going to get challenges with the number of rate changes on air tightness through the building, and potentially then could end up with air quality issues. You could end up with a build up around condensation, moisture, hot air, all of those kind of things within the home. How do you test for that? Well, there's a blower door test that's been around for a long time, but actually there is also a pulse test unit that could be used now and has been in use for quite some time. But what this is saying in terms of the sample evaluation is you want to understand your air tightness is required, you've got a target metric, you've identified what piece of equipment you're going to use to measure that. What this does not have in it actually is potentially the full sample of where you're doing that and the requirements, and then who's going to collect that information, then who's going to analyse it. So slightly more technical part of this in terms of your monitoring and evaluation plan, but that could be part of what you're identifying as well. Other things that you could look at, checking internal temperatures. So I think particularly when you're looking at changes to the heating system, really critical. It starts to get into much more complicated ways of how you do that. Now, I think it would be quite challenging to do this through just a sample questionnaire to say, well, actually, I really want to understand the internal temperatures, therefore, I'm going to use a questionnaire to do that. How comfortable do you feel? Do you need to put an extra jumper on? I don't think that would be a sensible way to do that. So there is equipment available now, so different sensors that is able to monitor that. The advances in this space have been enormous over the last 5 or 6 years. When I first started looking at how we measured internal temperatures and thermal efficiency of buildings, it was probably 6-7 years ago I first started looking at some of the innovations in this space. Originally, a lot of this was done through something called a co-heating test. Very complicated, very expensive. Even 7 or 8 years ago, it was around £25,000 a home to do. So not practical to be done at any sort of scale. And you had to decant the residents for, I think it was 2 weeks that you had to decant them for. So you can imagine not wildly popular either. There was a piece of work that was undertaken by the department, an innovation trial to develop alternative technology that was able to mimic that co-heating test. And that was taken through a very rigorous accreditation process, and those products are now out on the market. So you can bring in an organisation to do really detailed analysis of the thermal performance of your buildings and the comfort factor, both pre and post retrofit measures being used. You would bring in an organisation to do that with you, and then that data again would be analysed. Now, if you're not a bit of a data whiz, or if it's not your thing, you might also want to consider actually bringing someone in to work with you to analyse what that data meant, rather than just getting a myriad of data back that is perhaps not that useful in terms of how to use that data. To key things you might be looking at is how do you use that data to say, were they the appropriate measures to do on that property? Did we get the intended outcomes? As in, did we get for example, were we able to maintain the internal temperatures whilst reducing bills, for example? Or did, if we've gone perhaps from a gas system to a electrified heat, through a heat pump, were we able to keep the bills and the internal temperature at the levels we expected as our intended outcomes, as in cost neutral, for example? So there's capability to do that now. Again, it's one of these things where you probably wouldn't do it on your entire project. You wouldn't do it on every property that you were looking at upgraded. Many of these products are not fully verified for all types of products anyway, but it might be that you've got some particular stock that you're unsure whether there is real value, for example, on doing quite a complex external wall installation. So if you've done it on some properties, actually monitoring the performance that you got through that, the benefit of that. In some cases I've seen data where the improvements were less than expected in terms of thermal performance, and therefore actually the value for money of impact wasn't quite what was intended, and might be something that you would then consider in future planning. Do you actually spend the money on those type of measures, or do you look at different measures? So there's all sorts of ways that by doing sample monitoring and evaluation using more technical solutions, you can start to build that into your retrofit strategies and planning for the future, which can be really beneficial. It can start to help you to make really clear decisions around where you get the most value for money, what the retrofit strategy would be like, what performance you want from your buildings. Really valuable. But again, I would say when you start looking at this kind of solution rather than questionnaires, if you're not a technical whiz, if data's not your thing, or even if it is, but you just don't have the experience in looking at these kind of products and the outputs from them, it might be worth, when you look at who you're going to bring in to use their sensors, are they just providing you a sensor, or are they actually to provide you technical support and consultancy or advice as they go along? Because, much as I love data, having tons and tons of data that you aren't really able to analyze and use is not that helpful. But all of that is, and what I should say as well is that all of that, when you start to look at what the basic requirements of PAS 2035 are a significant stage on from that. So the basic requirements are much more straightforward and simple, but it provides you a platform that within your monitoring evaluation under PAS 2035, you can extend that and you can go further and broader depending on what your outcomes are for the project. Got a couple of examples here of where organisations have done that. So for example, you could look to monitor your renewable energy measures. So I think it's a really good example here, in terms of how do you choose what you monitor and why. So for example, you could put monitoring on PV. I mean, a lot of PV comes with monitoring anyway, but you could spend quite a lot of time in terms of looking at that. But I would say probably if you were saying, well, actually, I don't, there's only so much capacity we've got in the organisation, so much money that we want to spend on that, you might want to really focus on, perhaps you'd look at your heat pumps instead, because, ensuring that they are operating, in terms of optimising the system, in terms of operating at the expected, in line with the sizing for the system, for the heat demand of the property, that would be a much more useful set of data, because the risk factor of them not operating is resident dissatisfaction without question, but also things like increased risk of fuel poverty, loss of comfort, increased risk of mold and condensation. So actually faulty heat pumps, or heat pumps that are not optimized and not operating to the way that you'd expect it in terms of the outcomes of the project, is much more likely to be a big impact to you in your project than, for example, your solar PV is whether you actually got quite the predicted level of energy generation that you fully expected to through the modelling. There's always a degree of flexibility around some of these models that are used. So, how big a concern is that? So, yes, if you perhaps got from a 4 kilowatt system, massive straight away, but if you weren't getting what your expected capacity was from that system, yes, it could impact in terms of the benefit to the resident, how much you're able for the resident to use, how much of that is used perhaps as a offset for some of the billing, but actually in terms of risk, it's much lower in terms of risk. So understand again, what's your intended outcomes, and then developing your monitoring and evaluation plan to meet those intended outcomes, and where you consider the big risk areas is a really critical part of this. And again, this is all much more likely to be in an intermediate or an advanced monitoring. It is not going to be in your basic monitoring plan. And again, so other examples that we've got. So things that can go wrong in your system. So something like solar thermal, for example, could poor design, poor commissioning, poor maintenance, turned off by accident. I mean, that again is a common one. And the other one that is a really common one that we see is mechanical ventilation and heat recovery, that residents do turn them off, they don't use them, they don't like the noise, or they're concerned that it's the cost of electricity, they don't really understand how it works and how it operates. So those kind of things, actually monitoring that kind of thing could be really useful in terms of risk areas, because obviously if you turn mechanical ventilation and heat recovery off, then not only can it impact in terms of your overall how the system's supposed to operate, comfort, bills, all the rest of it, but actually can have much more significant consequences around increase of mold, damp and condensation in homes. So really critical that, again, that you understand what it is that your monitoring evaluation plan is there to do and how it's going to achieve those intended outcomes. I talked a little bit about failure points for PV, for example, differently. And again, this kind of thing is helpful because it helps you to decide whether it's something that you want to consider. So things like poor performance because actually, the modelling had not really taken into account some of the shading, or it wasn't completely installed. And again, another one turned off by accident, or you've got an electrical fault and it's gone into shutdown. All of the sort of things that potentially is there. So through your more advanced monitoring and evaluation plans, you can start to decide what you want to monitor and how, and who's going to capture that data, and then who's going to analyze the data. I would say that if you're looking at some of these PV systems, obviously the software of this is improved exponentially over the last few years. So that might be something you can work with your contractor side anyway, certainly in terms of notifications of failure or the PV no longer working. I think this is one where I think of all the things where we're looking at advanced or intermediate monitoring and evaluation, this would be the one that probably is highest on my radar, would be heat pumps. They are a mature technology in terms of globally, worldwide, but I would say as a country, we are still very much getting to grips with this. There is more work to be done to make sure that these systems are operating properly and that we're getting the right performance from them. So probably heat pump monitoring is the one that, if you're putting large numbers of heat pumps in, as well as your basic monitoring and evaluation questionnaires that you're doing with residents, probably heat pumps would be the one that I would really think about how to integrate that into your overall monitoring and evaluation system, because it's the one that is most likely to give concern to your residents. It is a newer technology for us as a country, as the UK, and actually making sure that we get the lessons learned from these systems and shared is really critical, both for you as an organisation, but also more widely. So I think that would be the one where absolutely I would say critically look at monitoring and evaluation through heat pumps. You could, as part of that basic evaluation, bring in some of these questions on, for example, if the occupant's only heating 1 or 2 rooms. We find, again, how people interact with the system is a really important thing. So quite often you'll find that that's really struggle to move from that. They've had a gas boiler, they're used to putting it on between, say, 7 and 9, and then it's off for the day, and then it comes back on between 4 till 8 or 5 till 10, however they live. I think understanding how your residents are interacting with the system through your questionnaire can be a really valuable part of understanding what potential problems you may or may not have with that heating system, and then how you mitigate those going forward as well. So things like people not heating the whole house and then perhaps not, turning it on and off and putting it on almost treating it as if they would a gas boiler would be a really important thing to understand through that. And then if you combine that with some of the more technical monitoring available through the manufacturer or through software providers, then actually you can start to get a really good picture of changes that you might need to bring into your future projects, as well as perhaps within your current projects, to address those things and mitigate against them. So do you actually need a much better resident engagement pack going forward? Do you need your resident liaison officers to work much more closely on these kind of things? What are the key challenges? We've seen some quite cool things that we've seen different local authorities and housing providers do is, things like a QR code on the heat pump that's been developed, and then it links to a little website and gives them some mythbuster stuff or some FAQs and things like that. So, some really innovative ideas where a problem's been identified through the monitoring and evaluation. And then the question is, what do you do with that data? How do you analyse that, and how do you take that then to change and mitigate against future problems and address the problems you've got now, so that you start to build up a more holistic approach to your retrofit projects through monitoring and evaluation. And I think that's just reiterated within this again. So I think that the key thing that I would flag on this side is, troubleshooting homes that are too expensive to run. I mean, that is obviously the biggest concern that residents have is actually, will there be an impact on their bills from these new systems? So again, it's really important to understand what the issues are, whether you need more handovers, whether you need better user education, and what the problems are. And I think the questionnaires can be a really useful part of understanding that, as well as the other technologies available. It is worth noting, just as a point on this, all of the renewables technologies that under the warm home schemes need to be done with an MCS design process in place. So some of the questions that absolutely could be part of your monitoring evaluation is, has the right heat loss been calculated for the building? Has it been sized? So, in terms of your intended outcomes, you do want to make sure that you have got the building performance around its internal temperatures, around comfort factors. Is it doing that? And you can build this in. So part of that can be then really useful in terms of how do you hold your contractor team to account? How do you hold your supply chain to account? So monitoring and evaluation isn't just useful from the point of view of understanding how your residents are interacting with their retrofit, or did you get the intended outcomes for your project, and therefore you've got a business case to write the next retrofit project, but actually can be a really valuable tool in terms of holding your contractors and supply chain to account as well. And again, some of that can be done through the questionnaires, but also through some of the monitoring equipment that's available out there, might be built into a more comprehensive intermediate or advanced monitoring and evaluation plan. So we've given some suggestions here of the type of things that you could add into those. Is, and again, this is just done through a questionnaire, which would be really useful, but you'll notice how specific these are. So, all right, the resident might not be able to fully say, is it being used correctly, but you would get answers back like, I don't really understand how to use this, or I'm not sure, or I'm still using it as I used to use my gas boiler. But some really easy ones, did they get a handover discussion? Had they read the documentation? And actually, in case of, perhaps more vulnerable customers, was the appropriate level of communication provided them with that resident to meet the needs of the resident? Through your contractor team, you might be looking at some more detailed things around controls and calculations and, radiators and all of those kind of things. And with monitoring and evaluation, it's about understanding what are the questions you're trying to ask, what were the intended outcomes, and then how are you linking all of those things together to say that actually you delivered those intended outcomes. So you're starting to pull together a whole series of different data points to understand, did you achieve the intended outcomes? And if you didn't, or if there are problems, what do you then need to do in terms of next steps to manage those? So recommended questionnaire features. These are things that we've picked up through our experience and through experience of working with different local authorities. So odd numbered scale, absolutely really helpful. Non-technical language, short, simple and direct, mix of closed and open questions, and questions that users can answer confidently, such as, are you getting the correct efficiency out of your heat pump? Yes, so obviously not that, but do you think you're benefiting from your new heat pump? Or does your home feel more comfortable? Have you noticed that you're now able to put, heat more rooms? We need to be, one of the real challenges that we have with retrofit, I mean, even retrofit itself, is it's quite technical language, and it can be quite difficult for residents to decipher that in a questionnaire. So making sure that that is thought about when you write your questionnaires is quite challenging. It's not the easiest thing to do, but really worth spending the time and thinking about those. And one of the things you can do is just do a little bit of sample testing on some of those and see what sort of answers you get back. I mean, that's how we always suggest that you work with odd numbered scales. And I've even seen ones that kind of jump them as well. So you can do things like gaps between your scaled numbers, so that people have to be, depends what you're trying to understand. If you just want to make sure that you allow a neutral response, so you've got 5 in the middle, for example, it's too fast either way, or do you actually want to kind of drive quite strong views on something, so put in gaps between, so people feel really strongly about a 1 and really strongly about a 5, and then perhaps a 9, or, and you're putting gaps in it. So understanding what the options are for those can be quite valuable. So here's an example question: how satisfied are you with the internal temperature of your home? And you can see there we've got an odd number, and then they can just answer that quite simply, straightforward. Satisfied, very satisfied, neither satisfied nor dissatisfied. I mean, what you obviously will get is people that are unhappy will very quickly respond to these, and you might get less of the ones that are satisfied or somewhat satisfied. But even that's really valuable in terms of identifying risks to your project and how you mitigate against that going forward. Yeah, and then timing, another good point. So understanding profiles are really important. So absolutely, if the time of your retrofit project ends, all the measures are finished in September, there isn't much point going out and asking them about how they find the new heating system or the insulation measures. And again, for PV, if it's mostly been in the winter that the PV was installed in October, and then you've run through the whole of the winter, asking them how they find the benefit from their PV system is going to be like, well, not great, to be honest. So understanding the time of that is really critical. So how do you do it? What's the easiest way of doing it? Well, as I said, I think, we've seen lots of different examples. I mean, more and more organisations are definitely using online survey tools. But I think, paper-based, again, knowing your residents, knowing who you want to engage with, where you want to pull this information from, resident forums. I mean, I personally really enjoy doing those kind of things where I go and sit in and get people really talking and hearing that, because you get so much more nuance in terms of understanding post retrofit follow-up events. So again, really good way of getting detailed feedback. And then the other thing you can do is resident interviews, and actually those can be really valuable, because then we've had organisations use, for example, feedback from resident interviews to be part of their communications package when they're going out to do the next retrofit project. So the monitoring and evaluation is not only for this project, but it's how do you set up the next project? How do you start to build, take those lessons learned, those communications, and start to set yourselves up ready to deliver your next project or next phase of projects? And then resources. So I just wanted to flag some of the resources we've got now. As I said at the start of this is a massive subject. There are huge amounts of resources. People devote whole days and packages. I mean, anyone that's seen there's a BS number for building performance, which the number falls out of my head right this moment, but it's 90 pages just dedicated to the specifics on building performance data. So there's lots and lots of resources out there. However, I appreciate time is challenging for all of us, so we do more masterclasses on specific subjects. One today has been aimed at being quite a basic overview of the basic requirements to do monitoring and evaluation. It's not intended to be anything more than that at this one, but we do more detailed ones, and there's toolkits and there's events that you can look at. So if you have not interacted with the Knowledge Hub, or this is your first masterclass, please do go online and look at ones that are already previously there. We've got toolkits, we've got explainers, we've got all sorts of documents there to help you navigate and understand this. So these are some of the specific ones that I've mentioned that we've done previously. So measuring your retrofit performance with data, airtight. We've got a specific one there on airtightness and retrofit. So we do these basic overview classes, but then we do very specific topics that go into much more detail. And then we've also got podcasts as well, where we bring experts across the sector to come and talk to us. So again, decarbonising retrofit buildings with data insights from Atomic. So if you've been curious to find out more from some of the things that I've said today, please do go and have a look at the on-demand resources that are already there and get a much more detailed set of information around some of the topics.